The silver light of a Manhattan dawn filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of our Park Avenue penthouse, catching the rhythmic rise and fall of Harrison's shoulders. At 59, I never expected to feel this electric again. My first marriage had been a long, comfortable slumber that ended in a quiet funeral, but Harrison at 49 was a lightning bolt to my soul. Looking at him, I felt like a teenager hiding a secret, except my secret was that I was finally living. I leaned back against the headboard, adjusted my silk robe, and glanced at the Cartier tank watch on my nightstand. It was 6 a.m. In 2 hours, I had a routine checkup with Maggie, but right now, the only thing on my mind was how Harrison had looked at me the night before at the gala at the Pierre. He didn't look at me like I was a woman with a successful interior design empire or a substantial trust fund. He looked at me like I was the only woman in the room. There is a specific kind of irony in being a woman of my age in New York. You spend half your life trying to be noticed, and the other half hoping the lighting is dim enough that people don't notice too much. But with Harrison, the lights were always on. He was a celebrated architect, a man who understood structure and beauty, and he claimed I was his greatest inspiration. We had spent the last weekend at our estate in the Hamptons, driving out in his Mercedes S-Class with the top down, the salt air tangling my hair. He had insisted on a sunset hike, which resulted in me discovering that my 59-year-old knees had a very loud opinion about steep inclines. We laughed until we cried when he practically had to hoist me up the last ledge like a sack of expensive flour. It was those moments, the breathless laughter and the way he'd kiss my forehead afterward, that made me believe I had beaten the odds. I was the lucky one who found a second chance at passion, while my peers were settling into knitting and disappointment. I slipped out of bed, careful not to wake him, and headed to the kitchen to trigger the Jura espresso machine. The smell of high-end beans filled the air, a scent that usually signaled the start of a productive day. I pulled up my iPad Pro to check some floor plans for a client on Fifth Avenue, but my mind kept drifting. Lately, I felt different. Not bad, just vibrant in a way that felt almost artificial. I attributed it to the new vitamin regimen Harrison had researched for me. He was so meticulous about my health, always bringing me a green smoothie or a specific supplement, claiming he wanted me by his side for at least another 40 years. It was sweet, if a bit hovering. I once joked that if he pampered me anymore, I'd forget how to tie my own shoes, to which he replied that he'd be honored to tie them for me every single day. As I drove myself to Maggie's office in my own vintage Porsche, I felt a strange sense of gratitude. Maggie had been my best friend since our days at Columbia, and she had seen me through the grief of widowhood and the frantic, dizzying honeymoon phase with Harrison. Walking into her Park Avenue clinic always felt like entering a sanctuary. The waiting room smelled of lavender and expensive stationery, a far cry from the sterile, terrifying hospitals of my youth. I waved to the receptionist and settled into a leather chair, picking up a copy of a luxury travel magazine, though I couldn't focus. I felt great. I felt invincible. Maggie greeted me with her usual warm, professional smile, but her eyes were sharp. We chatted about the latest exhibit at the Met and Harrison's recent project in Beverly Hills as I climbed onto the exam table. It was all very routine, very standard. We laughed about the indignities of aging and how we were both officially women of a certain vintage. But then, the laughter stopped. The room went quiet, save for the hum of the air conditioning. Maggie's hand paused. I saw her brow furrow through the reflection in the medical lamp. She wasn't looking at my charts anymore. She was staring at a small, discolored patch of skin, a subtle mark near my pelvic bone that I hadn't even realized was there. She didn't say a word for a long 10 seconds, and in that silence, the warmth of my perfect life began to feel like a cold draft under a locked door. Maggie's silence stretched thin, vibrating with an intensity that made the sterile air in the exam room feel heavy. She adjusted her glasses, the light from her professional-grade magnifying lamp casting a sharp, unforgiving glow on my skin. I tried to make a joke, my voice fluttering like a trapped bird. I told her that if she was looking for my lost youth, it had moved out years ago and hadn't left a forwarding address. Usually, Maggie would bark out a laugh, but today her lips remained a tight, thin line. She reached for a sterile swab, her movements clinical and precise, and gently touched the patch. It wasn't painful, just a faint, silvery blue marring of the skin, like a bruise that had forgotten how to heal. She asked me if I'd been using any new creams, or if Harrison had brought home any exotic oils from his recent trip to San Francisco. I laughed, remembering the organic lavender serum he'd insisted on applying to my shoulders every night as part of his devoted massage routine. He was so meticulous, so caring, treating my body like a fragile piece of art he was tasked with preserving. After the biopsy was taken, I dressed in a daze, the silk of my blouse feeling oddly abrasive. Maggie told me she'd call me on my iPhone 15 Pro the moment the lab results were back, but her eyes wouldn't meet mine. I walked out into the crisp New York afternoon, the familiar chaos of Park Avenue swirling around me. I needed a moment to breathe, so I ducked into a Starbucks reserve. Standing in line, I caught my reflection in the polished chrome of the espresso machine. I looked like the woman I was supposed to be, well-dressed, wealthy, loved. A younger man in a sharp suit accidentally bumped into me, spilling a drop of his latte on my coat. He apologized profusely, calling me ma'am, with that respectful tone that usually made me want to scream, but today it just felt like a reminder of the gap between my world and Harrison's. I sat by the window, watching the yellow cabs crawl toward Grand Central, and tried to convince myself I was overreacting. When I returned to the penthouse, the scent of expensive cedar and roasting chicken greeted me. Harrison was in the kitchen, his MacBook Pro open on the marble island, likely finalizing the blueprints for the new library in Greenwich. He looked up, his smile radiant, the kind of smile that could convince you the sun rose specifically for you. He wrapped his arms around me, his grip firm and warm, and for a second, the cold dread from the doctor's office melted away. He noticed I was quiet and immediately began his Operation Cheer Up. He bought a new high-tech AI-integrated blender that looked more like a rocket ship than a kitchen appliance. He tried to demonstrate how it could molecularly optimize my afternoon smoothie, but he couldn't figure out the voice commands. Watching this brilliant architect argue with a blender, shouting, "Make kale delicious," at a glowing blue screen, I actually burst into a genuine, belly-deep laugh. It was so absurd, so human. But later that evening, as he moved to the nightstand to get my vitamin cocktail, I saw him pause. He didn't know I was watching through the reflection of the vanity mirror. His expression shifted. The warmth vanished, replaced by a cold, calculating focus as he carefully measured a clear liquid from a small, unlabeled vial into my glass. He caught my gaze in the mirror, and in a heartbeat, the mask of the doting husband was back in place. He blew me a kiss, his eyes twinkling with a devotion that suddenly felt like a polished performance. My phone vibrated on the duvet. A text from Maggie, just 3 words, "Call me now." I locked the door of the ensuite bathroom, the sound of the deadbolt echoing against the Italian marble walls. My heart was thumping against my ribs like a trapped bird. Maggie's voice on the other end of the line wasn't the voice of my best friend. It was the voice of a professional who had seen something she couldn't unsee. "Clarissa," she whispered, her tone jagged and urgent. "That mark isn't a skin condition. The lab just sent over the preliminary analysis. It's a localized reaction to a very specific synthetic compound, a derivative used in experimental hormone therapy, but it's toxic if not monitored. It's being applied topically, Clarissa. Someone is quite literally painting a slow-acting poison onto your skin, and your body is absorbing it every night. The lavender serum. The nightly massages Harrison insisted on, claiming they were the secret to my everlasting glow." My stomach did a slow, nauseating flip. I looked at the bathroom counter where an Amazon box sat. I'd recently ordered a Kindle and a few copies of Atomic Habits to give to my staff, trying to stay productive despite my fatigue. I felt like a fool, a wealthy, well-educated woman who had been groomed like a prize mare. I walked back into the bedroom, my legs feeling like lead. Harrison was sitting on the edge of the bed, his back to me, writing in a leather-bound journal with his silver Mont Blanc pen. He looked so peaceful, the epitome of the devoted husband. I knew I had to see what was in that vial he'd used earlier. I waited for him to head to the kitchen to refresh his drink. The second the door clicked shut, I dived toward his nightstand. Now I am 59, not a secret agent. In my haste, I caught my toe on the corner of the Persian rug and landed face first on the hardwood with a thud that likely vibrated through the floor to the neighbors below. Harrison called out from the hallway, "Clarissa, honey, is everything okay?" I scrambled into a crouch, my mind racing. When he walked in, he found me on all fours, frantically patting the floorboards. "I can't find it, Harrison. My Tiffany diamond stud. The one you gave me for the anniversary. I think it popped out when I took off my robe." I wailed, my voice cracking with a genuine terror that he mistook for distress over the jewelry. Harrison knelt beside me, his hand resting on the small of my back, his touch making my skin crawl. "Don't worry, darling. We'll find it. Nothing is ever truly lost in this house," he said, his voice like velvet. He found the earring in seconds. It was sitting right on the vanity where I had intentionally left it. And as he handed it to me, I noticed his cuticles were stained with a faint yellowish residue. He handed me the glass of vitamin water he had prepared. I stared at the clear liquid, the surface tension holding back the secret Maggie had just unveiled. I took a small sip, pretending to swallow while holding the bitter liquid in my cheek, before excusing myself to the bathroom to spit it out. Later that evening, he suggested a stroll near the Central Park West entrance. The city lights were shimmering, and the air was cool, smelling of rain and expensive pretzels. He held my hand, pointing out the architecture of the San Remo building, his architect's brain always at work. We passed a younger couple near the Strawberry Fields Memorial, their laughter ringing through the night. Harrison leaned in, his breath warm against my ear. "That will be us in 20 years, Clarissa. I've made sure our future is preserved." I looked at the Manhattan skyline, the soaring towers standing like silent witnesses to his treachery. I realized then that my marriage wasn't a sanctuary. It was a meticulously designed trap. As we turned toward our building, an Amazon delivery van pulled up. The driver handed a small, heavy package to our doorman. It was addressed to Harrison, but the return label was from a private clinical supply house in Switzerland. Harrison snatched it before the doorman could even scan it, his smile never wavering, but his grip on my arm tightened just enough to leave a mark. The next morning, Harrison left the penthouse earlier than usual, claiming a breakfast meeting with a group of investors from the West Coast. He looked impeccable in his charcoal Tom Ford suit, the light catching the polished bezel of the Rolex Submariner I'd bought him for his 48th birthday. He kissed me deeply, a lingering, theatrical display of affection that now felt like the cold press of a coin against my lips. He mentioned Isabella would be there to handle the aesthetic presentation, her name rolling off his tongue with a practiced neutrality that made my skin prickle. As soon as his Mercedes S-Class pulled away from the curb, I found myself standing in the center of his home office, a room that smelled of expensive leather and old blueprints. I sat at his mahogany desk and stared at his MacBook Pro. For years I had respected his privacy, believing that trust was the invisible mortar of a strong marriage. Now, that mortar was crumbling into dust. I tried the password. My birthday. It worked instantly, a stinging reminder of how easily he played on my sentimentality. I navigated through his files, my hands shaking as I searched for anything related to the Swiss medical supply house or the mysterious Project Renaissance he'd mentioned once during a dinner at the River Cafe. I found a folder buried 3 layers deep, filled with digital invoices. They weren't for architectural supplies. They were for consultation fees paid to a shell company based in Delaware, all authorized by Isabella. In the midst of my digital sleuthing, I had a sudden, desperate urge to know where he actually was. I remembered my niece showing me a Find My feature on the family account. I pulled up my own iPad, my eyes squinting at the tiny icons. In my frantic state, I managed to accidentally trigger a loud, high-pitched ping on his device. I froze, my heart stopping. A notification popped up on the screen, alert sent to Harrison's iPhone. I let out a sound that was half sob, half maniacal laugh. Here I was, a high-end interior designer whose work had been featured in Architectural Digest, acting like a bumbling amateur in a cheap spy novel. I quickly sent him a text. "Oops, just testing the new security app the building manager installed. Technology is going to be the death of me. Love you." He didn't reply for 20 minutes. When he finally did, it was a short, breezy, Haha, no worries, darling. Focus on your designs. See you tonight. The lack of an I love you back felt like a heavy stone dropped into a dark well. I couldn't stay in the apartment. I needed to see him, to see them with my own eyes. I decided to follow them to the Chelsea Art District where the meeting was supposed to be held. I didn't dare take my Porsche. It was too recognizable. Instead, I called a luxury Uber Black. The driver was a young man in his early 20s who insisted on playing a heavy bass-boosted remix of a song I didn't recognize while offering me a complimentary bottle of artisanal water. He asked if I was heading to a gallery opening, noting that I looked very classy. I thanked him, feeling like an imposter in my own life. We pulled up near a sleek, glass-fronted bistro overlooking the High Line. Through the tinted window of the car, I saw them. They weren't in a conference room with investors. They were tucked into a corner booth, their heads close together. Isabella was laughing, her hand resting familiarly on Harrison's forearm. He was looking at her with a raw, hungry intensity that he hadn't shown me in months. But it wasn't just the intimacy that caught my breath. On the table between them sat a small black velvet box from Tiffany & Co. Harrison opened it, and even from the street, I could see the flash of a diamond that was far too large to be a business gift. As Isabella leaned in to kiss his cheek, I caught sight of his other hand. He was holding a small, clear vial, the exact same one I had seen in our bedroom. He slipped it into her designer handbag as if it were a common lipstick, and the look of shared understanding they exchanged made the air in my lungs turn to ice. The drive back to Park Avenue was a blur of rain-streaked neon and the bitter aftertaste of the cold Starbucks coffee I'd abandoned in the cup holder. I walked into our penthouse, and for the first time, the quiet didn't feel like luxury. It felt like a tomb. Harrison wasn't home yet. I knew I had to find the source of his confidence, the paper trail that emboldened him to treat my life like a disposable asset. I marched into his private study, a room filled with the scent of expensive tobacco and the silent judgment of his architectural awards. My eyes landed on a large, moody, abstract piece hanging behind his desk, a work we'd acquired for a staggering sum on Fifth Avenue. Harrison was always oddly protective of it, adjusting it by a fraction of an inch every Sunday morning. I dragged an heavy, velvet-upholstered chair over to the wall, my joints protesting with a dull ache that reminded me I wasn't 28 anymore. As I climbed up, my silk skirt snagged on a decorative carving, and for a terrifying second, I swayed like a leaf in a gale. I let out a yelp as I narrowly avoided knocking over his Mont Blanc crystal inkwell, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. There I was, a pillar of the New York design community, dangling off a chair like a common burglar, muttering curses at a piece of modern art. I reached behind the frame, my fingers brushing against something cold and metallic. It wasn't a safe, but a recessed niche built into the wall with the precision only an architect could manage. Inside sat a slim, navy blue Dior portfolio. I climbed down, my hands trembling as I unzipped it on the mahogany desk next to his MacBook Pro. The first thing I saw was a series of wire transfer confirmations. Hundreds of thousands of dollars moved from my primary business account into an offshore entity in the Cayman Islands. But the real blow came further down. It was a property deed for a luxury condo in Beverly Hills. The owner wasn't Harrison. It was Isabella. He had been using my sweat and my legacy to build a golden cage for a woman who wasn't even born when I started my firm. Tucked into the back of the portfolio was a document that made my breath hitch, a post-nuptial amendment that supposedly bore my signature, granting Harrison full control of my estate in the event of my medical incapacitation. I stared at the signature. It was a perfect forgery, executed with the same steady hand that drew the blueprints of my dreams. I sat there in the dark, the blue light from the city reflecting off the polished surface of the desk. I thought about the vitamins he gave me, the subtle mark on my skin, and the way he smiled as he watched me drink. He wasn't just waiting for me to die. He was architecting my decline, ensuring I was too confused or ill to notice the world being stripped from beneath my feet. A small, hysterical laugh escaped my throat. I had spent 30 years designing interiors to make people feel safe, and all the while I had built a home for a predator. I heard the heavy thud of the penthouse door closing. The familiar, rhythmic sound of Harrison's footsteps on the hardwood sent a jolt of pure, cold adrenaline through me. I quickly tucked the portfolio back into its hiding place and straightened the painting. I barely managed to hop off the chair and smooth my hair before he walked in, his Rolex gleaming under the hallway light. He looked tired, his eyes softening as they landed on me. "Clarissa? Why are you sitting in the dark, darling?" He walked over, his hand reaching out to brush a stray hair from my forehead, his touch as light and lethal as a spider's web. I looked at Harrison's outstretched hand, the skin smooth and tan, a hand that had sketched the most beautiful structures in the city, and had also, apparently, sketched my own demise. I forced a smile, though it felt like my face was made of brittle parchment. I told him I had a sudden, urgent design crisis with a client at the Ritz-Carlton and needed to head out. He frowned, his thumb tracing the line of my jaw, in a way that used to send shivers of desire down my spine, but now only triggered a wave of nausea. He offered to drive me in the Mercedes, but I insisted on taking a car service, claiming I needed to work on my MacBook Pro during the ride. I didn't go to a meeting. I followed the GPS pinger I had secretly tucked into the pocket of his favorite cashmere overcoat earlier that afternoon. The icon pulsed like a dying star on my iPhone 16 Pro Max, moving steadily toward Midtown. I watched through the window of my Uber as the Manhattan skyline blurred into a smear of cold electric blues and grays. The car stopped in front of a discreet, high-end boutique hotel tucked away near Gramercy Park. It was the kind of place where the staff was paid for their silence, and the rooms cost more than most people made in a month. I slipped into the lobby, my heart hammering so loudly I was sure the concierge could hear it. I saw them at the far end of the bar, bathed in the amber glow of a $1,000 chandelier. They weren't just partners. Harrison was leaning over Isabella, his hand possessively on the small of her back as she laughed, a sound that cut through me like a serrated blade. She was wearing a necklace I recognized, a vintage Cartier piece that had vanished from my safe 3 months ago. I had cried for days thinking I'd misplaced it, and there it was, sparkling against the skin of a woman who was young enough to be my daughter. In my desperation to get a closer look, I tried to duck behind a massive, towering arrangement of white calla lilies. As I shifted my weight, my Dior heel caught the edge of the marble floor. I did a frantic, undignified little wobble, my Prada bag swinging wildly and nearly taking out a tray of martinis being carried by a passing waiter. I managed to grab the edge of a velvet curtain just in time, standing there breathless and looking like a panicked bird in an evening gown. For a second, Harrison glanced toward the commotion, and I froze, praying the shadows were deep enough to swallow me whole. He turned back to her, and that's when I saw the final blow. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, gold-embossed envelope. He slid it across the table with a wink. Isabella opened it, her eyes widening as she pulled out the keycard to a penthouse suite, not in New York, but in London. "A new beginning," I saw him mouth the words. He leaned in and kissed her, a deep, passionate kiss that held all the promises he had once whispered into my ear. I turned and stumbled out into the night. It had started to pour, a typical New York deluge that turned the streets into rivers of black ink. I stood on the corner of 23rd Street, my silk coat soaking through, watching the lights of Times Square reflect in the puddles like shattered dreams. I didn't even try to find an umbrella. The rain felt honest. It was the only thing in my life that wasn't a lie. I leaned against a cold street lamp and let the tears finally come, sobbing silently as the city roared around me, indifferent to the fact that my world had just turned into a pile of ash. I didn't stay in the ashes for long. By the time the sun rose over the East River, the weeping widow had been replaced by the CEO who had built an empire from a single drafting table. I dried my hair, put on a sharp power suit from Dior, and headed straight to a discreet office in a glass tower overlooking Wall Street. I wasn't there to see an architect. I was there to see Victor Thorne, a man whose reputation for dismantling unfaithful husbands was as legendary as his collection of vintage Ferraris. Victor sat behind a massive desk of reclaimed oak, tapping a rhythm on his MacBook Pro 16-inch. He had been a friend of my late husband, a man who believed in loyalty above all else. When I showed him the digital copies of the forged documents and the offshore transfers I'd pulled from Harrison's Dior portfolio, Victor's eyes turned into cold flints. He told me that in New York, betrayal was a civil matter, but forgery and grand larceny were very much a matter for the state. We needed Harrison to take the final step, to walk into the trap he had designed for me. Victor called it the ghost gambit. I had to play the part of the fading, confused wife, letting Harrison believe his vitamins were finally stripping away my sharp edges. The next few days were a masterclass in performance art. I returned to the penthouse and leaned heavily into the role. When Harrison brought me my evening cocktail, I would gaze at the glass with a vacant, dreamy expression, murmuring about how foggy the Manhattan skyline looked. One afternoon, I decided to add a touch of ditzy humor to my performance to keep him off balance. I walked into the kitchen while he was on a call with Isabella and purposefully tried to put my iPad Pro into the toaster, complaining that I couldn't find the bread slot. The look of suppressed glee on Harrison's face was almost worth the risk of an electrical fire. He rushed over, gently taking the device from me with a condescending pat on the head. "Oh, Clarissa, darling, you're just working too hard. Why don't you go lie down? I'll handle the dinner reservations at the River Cafe." I caught a glimpse of him smirking as he turned back to his phone, likely texting Isabella that the old bird was finally losing her feathers. It was a humiliating charade, but every time I felt like screaming, I thought of the Beverly Hills deed and the stolen Cartier necklace. Maggie remained my silent anchor. We replaced my vitamins with harmless supplements that looked identical, and she monitored my vitals daily via a secure link on my Apple Watch. She warned me that the Swiss package Harrison had received was likely the final piece of his puzzle. A high-dose sedative that would make me appear medically incompetent long enough for him to exercise the forged power of attorney. Victor and I spent our mornings at a quiet corner table in a Barnes & Noble bookstore near Union Square, surrounded by the smell of new paper and Starbucks lattes. It was the perfect cover for a woman supposedly losing her mind. We went over the plan. I would invite Harrison to a private dinner to celebrate a new, massive investment I was supposedly making in his firm. A fake $10 million infusion from my trust. To secure it, he would need to sign a series of intercompany transfers that Victor had meticulously drafted. In reality, those papers were a full confession of his previous thefts, disguised in complex legal jargon that only a shark like Victor could navigate. As I sat there, clutching a copy of the 48 Laws of Power I'd pulled from the shelf, I looked out at the bustling New York streets. I saw a woman my age walking a golden retriever, her face radiant with a simple, uncomplicated joy. I realized then that I wasn't just fighting for my money. I was fighting for the right to be that woman again. To live without a shadow across my heart. Harrison thought he was architecting my downfall. But he had forgotten one vital rule: never underestimate a woman who has spent 30 years perfecting the structures of other people's lives. She knows exactly where the load-bearing walls are, and she knows exactly which one to kick to make the whole house come down. The evening air was thick with the scent of white lilies and the quiet hum of Manhattan's late-night traffic pulsing 40 floors below. I had orchestrated a celebratory dinner in our dining room, the table glowing under the soft light of a vintage baccarat chandelier. I wore a silk gown that cost more than Harrison's first car, and I had Maggie's secret antidote pills tucked under my tongue. Harrison was in high spirits, having just parked his Mercedes S-Class and bounded into the penthouse with the energy of a man who thought he was about to inherit a kingdom. He looked at me with that doting, predatory warmth, his Rolex gleaming as he poured 2 glasses of a 1997 Opus One from Napa Valley. "Harrison, darling," I began, my voice intentionally airy, almost drifting as if I were struggling to keep my thoughts from floating away. "I've been thinking about the London project. I'm so grateful for how you've looked after me lately, with all my fogginess. I want to move $10 million from my legacy trust into your firm's expansion fund tomorrow. I want to make sure your future is as secure as the one you've designed for me." I watched his pupils dilate, the raw, naked greed flickering behind his eyes like a guttering flame. He moved to my side, his hand resting on my shoulder in a gesture he thought was comforting, but felt like the weight of a vulture's wing. "Clarissa, you're so generous," he whispered, his voice thick with suppressed triumph. "We should get the paperwork sorted tonight so the bank can process it first thing. I don't want you worrying your beautiful head about it anymore." He reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a stack of documents, along with his silver Mont Blanc pen. He had everything ready: the forged power of attorney, the transfer deeds, the end of my life as I knew it. I blinked slowly, playing the part of the confused socialite to perfection. I reached for the wine bottle, intending to refill his glass, but in my dazed state, I grabbed a heavy pair of silver poultry shears from the Tiffany service set instead. I started trying to unscrew the top of the wine bottle with the shears, grunting with faux frustration. "Harrison, I think the bottle is broken. It won't open. Why is the silver so slippery?" Harrison let out a short, condescending laugh, the kind a parent gives a toddler. He gently took the shears from me, shaking his head. "You're just tired, sweetheart. Let me handle the wine. You just sign these investment authorizations so we can go to bed." He laid the papers out on the marble table next to his MacBook Pro. My heart was a drum in my ears. These weren't the documents he had drafted. Victor Thorne had replaced them in Harrison's briefcase during a chance encounter at the Ritz-Carlton earlier that day while Harrison was distracted by a fake phone call. Harrison, blinded by the $10 million carrot I was dangling, didn't even glance at the fine print. He thought he was signing my life away. In reality, he was signing a series of affidavits of corporate disclosure that detailed every offshore transfer he'd made, framed as a voluntary confession for a settlement. He scribbled his signature with a flourish, the Mont Blanc scratching against the paper. "Done," he said, his smile widening into a grin that didn't reach his eyes. "Everything is taken care of now, Clarissa. You can finally rest." I leaned back, my foggy expression slowly sharpening into a blade of pure cold ice. I took a slow sip of the wine he thought had drugged me. "You're right, Harrison. I've never felt more awake." Just as he started to frown at the sudden change in my tone, his iPhone 16 Pro Max on the table lit up with a notification from his bank. It wasn't an alert about a $10 million deposit. It was a notification that his personal and corporate accounts had been frozen by a court order. His face went from tan to a sickly, grayish white in a matter of seconds. The Plaza Hotel was a shimmering cathedral of gold leaf and crystal that evening. Emily, my daughter from my first marriage, was a vision in white silk, her smile the only thing more radiant than the Manhattan skyline visible through the arched windows. Harrison was standing beside me, his hand trembling slightly against the sleeve of his Tom Ford tuxedo. He was a cornered animal, pretending to be a predator. He had spent the last 48 hours frantically trying to fix the bank error, unaware that every desperate call he made to his offshore contacts was being recorded by Victor Thorne's team on a MacBook Pro. I had forced him to attend the wedding, whispering that if he didn't, I would pull my investment entirely. It was a cruel game, but I was playing for my life. The music swelled, a strings ensemble playing a modern arrangement of Vivaldi. It was the height of New York society. Rolexes glinted under the chandeliers, and the scent of Chanel No. 5 mingled with the $1,000 floral arrangements. At one point, I decided to play the emotional mother card one last time. I stood up to give a toast, but in my feigned clumsiness, I managed to accidentally dump an entire glass of vintage Bollinger onto Isabella's Dior gown as she tried to sneak into the back of the room. The look of pure, unadulterated fury on her face as she tried to scrub bubbles off her silk bodice was the most satisfying comedy I'd seen in decades. I apologized with a saccharine smile, offering her a wet napkin that I knew was soaked in cheap gin from the bar. Watching her fuming in the corner, smelling like a dive bar in a 5-star ballroom, was a small but delicious victory. Then came the moment everyone waited for: the bouquet toss. Emily stood on the grand staircase, her eyes meeting mine with a secret, sharp intelligence. She had been my shadow ally, the one who helped Victor coordinate the final move. She spun around and threw the white peonies with a deliberate arc. They landed squarely in my arms. The guests cheered, laughing at the luck of the mother of the bride catching her own daughter's flowers. But as I pulled the bouquet close, I saw a small, cream-colored card tucked deep between the petals. At her wedding, my daughter tossed me the bouquet, and when I saw the note, my heart finally found its steady rhythm again. I pulled it out, my fingers steady as Harrison leaned in, his eyes darting around the room as he spotted two men in dark, nondescript suits standing by the Fifth Avenue exit. I opened the note. It wasn't a sentimental message. In Emily's precise handwriting, it read, "The federal agents have the Swiss vials. Isabella's handbag has been searched. It's over, Mom. Catch him." I looked up at Harrison, the mask finally dropping. I didn't look like a fading, foggy widow anymore. I looked like the woman who owned the room. Just as the band began a lively jazz set, Victor Thorne stepped out from behind a pillar, followed by the agents. Harrison tried to bolt toward the service entrance, nearly tripping over a Cartier display case in his panic. But the exit was blocked. The room went silent as the lead agent stepped forward, his badge reflecting the light of the baccarat chandelier. "Harrison Vane, you are under arrest for grand larceny, forgery, and conspiracy to commit aggravated assault with a controlled substance." Beside him, Isabella let out a shrill cry as handcuffs clicked around her wrists, the stolen Cartier necklace glinting like a collar of shame. The perfect architect was escorted out of the plaza in front of every person whose respect he had spent my money to buy. As they were led away, I took a deep breath of the lavender-scented air. For the first time in months, the weight on my chest was gone, replaced by a triumphant clarity. 6 months after the lights of the police cruisers faded outside the plaza, the air in my Park Avenue penthouse finally felt breathable again. The legal battle had been a whirlwind of depositions and forensic accounting, but Victor Thorne had been a shark in a tailored suit. Harrison was now serving 15 years for grand larceny and attempted poisoning, while Isabella's dreams of a London penthouse had been replaced by a cramped cell in upstate New York. The court had stripped Harrison of every cent he tried to steal, returning my legacy to its rightful place. I spent the first few weeks after the trial purging the apartment of his presence. I threw out the vitamin bottles, the Tom Ford suits, and even that moody abstract painting that had hidden his hoard of lies. I'm sitting on my balcony now, the Manhattan skyline glowing in the twilight like a sea of fallen stars. I'm 60 years old, and for the first time in my life, I don't feel the need to design a facade for anyone else. My new MacBook Air sits on my lap, but I'm not looking at floor plans. I'm looking at photos from a weekend trip to a quiet cabin in upstate New York. I've traded the high-stress galas for morning walks and real conversations. Beside me on the glass table is a stack of books I finally have time to read. Marcus Aurelius's Meditations is on top, its ancient wisdom a soothing balm for the chaos I've endured. Thomas is in the kitchen, and the sound of him humming a jazz tune is the most comforting thing I've ever heard. He's 62. A history professor at NYU with a penchant for tweed jackets and a laugh that sounds like warm honey. We met at a Starbucks Reserve near Union Square while I was struggling to use a new, overly complicated digital rewards app. He had watched me nearly throw my iPhone into the trash in frustration and stepped in with a gentle smile to help. We ended up talking for 3 hours about the architecture of old New York and the importance of a good cup of black coffee. There was no molecular optimization or hidden vials, just a man who saw me, not my bank account. Last week, we had a moment that still makes me chuckle. I had ordered a new ergonomic desk chair from an Amazon box, determined to be a self-sufficient woman of the modern age. 2 hours into the assembly, I was surrounded by half-tightened screws and a set of instructions that seemed to be written in a lost language. Thomas walked in to find me sitting on the floor, wearing a Cartier watch and a pair of yoga pants, threatening to architecturally deconstruct the chair with a hammer. Instead of patronizing me, he sat down on the rug, handed me a glass of wine, and we spent the next hour failing to build it together while laughing until our sides ached. We ended up using the box as a makeshift coffee table for our pizza, and it was the most romantic dinner I've had in a decade. I pick up my Kindle and settle into the lounger, feeling the cool evening breeze. My body has healed, the subtle mark on my skin is gone, replaced by a healthy glow that comes from actual peace, not synthetic hormones. I've realized that aging isn't a decline to be managed or a weakness to be exploited. It's a harvest. My success, my wealth, and my heart are mine again. Thomas comes out and places a hand on my shoulder, his touch steady and honest. He doesn't want to preserve me. He just wants to grow old with me. I look out at the city that once felt like a hunting ground and realize it's actually a garden. I've been replanted in better soil, and for the first time, I'm truly in bloom. Sunday mornings in Manhattan have a different soul. The frantic energy of the work week gives way to the scent of fresh rain on the pavement and the distant chime of church bells from Fifth Avenue. Thomas and I are walking through the Ramble in Central Park, 2 paper cups of Starbucks Reserve coffee warming our hands. He's telling me about a first-edition history book he found at a small shop yesterday, his eyes sparking with that genuine, unpretentious fire I've come to adore. I stop for a moment to watch a group of children chasing bubbles near the fountain. A year ago, I was a woman living in a beautiful cage, my body a map of a stranger's treachery. Today, the subtle mark that Maggie found is nothing more than a memory, a scar that taught me how to breathe again. I reach into my bag and touch the smooth surface of my Kindle, where a book on mindfulness is waiting. But for now, I don't need the words of others to feel centered. I just need this. Thomas notices my silence and slows his pace, tucking a loose strand of hair behind my ear. He doesn't ask if I'm okay. He knows I am. He just smiles, that quiet, steady smile that makes me feel like I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. We aren't a high-powered couple on a billboard or a headline in a gossip column. We are just 2 people who found each other in the quiet after the storm. As we walk toward the Bethesda Terrace, the sunlight filters through the elms, casting long, golden shadows across the path. I realized then that the best part of my life didn't end at 50. It was just waiting for the lies to clear so it could finally begin. Healing isn't about erasing the past. It's about realizing that you are the architect of your own joy, and this time, the foundation is made of truth.